So welcome to the HKDI Master Lecture Series of Suites Designed Today and Tomorrow. Okay, so good morning, Professor Sauter.
Morning, or good afternoon.
Good afternoon to Suites. Okay, so before we start the lecture, so let me introduce our guest speaker today. So it's our honor to invite Professor Chris Sauter to be our guest speaker for today's lecture, Immersion in the Age of Anxiety. Okay, so Professor Sauter is an artist and professor for immersive art, and he is a director of the Immersive Art Space at the Zurich University of the Arts. He was also a professor of design and computation arts at Concordia University in Montreal, and also the former director of Hexagram Concordia Center for Research Creation in Media Arts and Technology. He has got a cross-disciplinary background. He studied philosophy, economics, theater, and computer music at Emory and Stanford University. His solo and collaborative works have been seen all over the world, including Venice, Architecture Biennial, Ars Electronica, Barbican Center, ZKM, etc. He's also the author of several publications published by MIT Press, including Entangled Technology and the Transformation of Performance, Aliens Agency, Experimental Encounter with Art in the Making. And recently, he has a new book called Sensor Machine, How Sensors Shape Our Everyday Life on Human and Machine Sensing. So now may I invite Professor Sauter to introduce the topic today. So Professor Sauter, please.
So thank you very much, and welcome everybody online. Let me just, it's a bit early here. Let me just pull up my keynote for you. Share the sound. Okay. So I changed the title of the talk as usual to a bit more looking at the question of extended reality, critical extended reality, promises, presences, and practices. As the introduction went, so I'm Chris Sauter. I'm professor of immersive arts and director of the Immersive Art Space at the Zurich University of the Arts. As of June 1st, I just started actually just a few months ago. And I'm also professor emeritus at Concordia University in Montreal, where I worked for 17 years in the Department of Design and Computation Arts. I also was the former co-director of a large-scale research network in Quebec called the Hexagram Network, which is between 8 Quebec universities as well as cultural institutions in Montreal and internationally. And I was also the co-founder and former associate director of a center in my own university in Concordia, Milieu Institute for the Arts, Culture and Technology, Concordia. So I have many hats. I have the hat of an artist, the hat of a scholar, the hat of a teacher, and the hat of a research director. So I'll just quickly give you a bio. As in terms of the introduction, I studied economics and philosophy, and then I did a PhD at Stanford University in theater, as well as doing work at the Center for Computer Research and Music and Acoustics at Stanford, CARMA, in computer generated sound. And the fact that I'm trained in the humanities, the social sciences, the arts and technology gives me a kind of very broad interdisciplinary approach. I would say both my artistic and my scholarly work lies at the nexus of a number of different fields. One is the arts, particularly arts involving new technologies, the social studies of science and technology, which we call in North America, Science and Technology Studies, or STS, the anthropology of the senses, and media and performance studies. So my work moves between, as I said, artistic and scholarly work, and how these things complement and shape each other. My work, having been trained in these different disciplines, my work very much involves large-scale immersive installations that are influenced by a number of disciplines, by theater, design, architecture, the visual arts, computer music, perceptual psychology, cultural theory, and engineering. And these projects are developed in collaboration with anthropologists, historians, philosophers, engineers, artists, and designers. And as was said also in the introduction, I have exhibited work all over the world. So as a little bit of a background, my here are four themes of work that I'm dealing with in current research and also production. The first is what the anthropologist Lucy Suchman and Zhu call, quote, the coupling of humans with computational devices taken to extend their native capacities through information processing. So it's the way human bodies are increasingly being mediated and shaped by technologies of performance, so involving questions of mixed reality or spatial computing, where in fact the real world and the virtual world are increasingly mixing. The question also about co-production between humans and machines in augmented or sensate or intelligent environments. The kind of larger questions about machine learning, maybe less about how machine learning is used to produce things, and more about how it's integrated within larger also human systems. So you might call this the performance of machine learning, or the performativity. Finally, look at histories of intersection of design, art, and computation. These just, if you're interested, these are 3 books. This is Entangled. This is a history of technology and performance from the end of the 19th century into the late 2008, across different fields: theater, design, media art, sound, visual arts, and so on. Predominantly Western, European, and American, although it does focus also on Australia, Japan. This is Alien Agency, which is an ethnography and anthropological study of how artists work with responsive technologies. So there are 3 case studies. One deals with sound, one deals with work that I did in the art and biology laboratory Symbiotica in the University of Western Australia, involving building machines out of tissue, so literally culturing human or animal cells. And the third project is on sound. And then this is the most recent book, which deals with how sensing is shaping our everyday experience across multiple fields: games, eating, driving, jogging, sleeping, dreaming, and so on. As I said, here's the previous context. This is my former lab, X Modal. This gives you a background about what I'm going to talk about. This is the new center, which are increasingly kind of larger scale research centers within university context that bring together artists, designers, engineers, social scientists, and humanists. And then this is a Hexagram. This is a big project that was done at the Ars Electronica in 2018, exhibition, talks, and so on. And these are projects just to give you a sense of the kind of scale. This is in Berliner Festspiele. This is in the Barbican Center. This is a project called Totem, dealing with spiking neurons for a big exhibition on AI that was actually in China in Guangdong last year. And then this is another project again, Polytope. So this is the Immersive Art Space. The Immersive Art Space is a large research, teaching, and production infrastructure at the Zurich University of the Arts. It's kind of unparalleled in Switzerland in terms of let's say infrastructures, research centers that look at questions of immersion through the lens of art and design. There are a number, of course, centers in the technical universities, but they're predominantly dealing with improving technical systems, whereas we're focused on, let's say, a critical technical reflection, what Philip Agri calls critical technical practice, and increased awareness and reflection on the hidden assumptions, ideologies, and values that underlie technology's design and use. So there are kind of 3 research themes in the immersive art space. One is spatial technologies, so-called spatial augmented reality. This involves spatialized audio, projection mapping, real-time motion capture, and so on. Then there is a track on worn technologies, which predominantly involves virtual reality, but increasingly moving toward extended reality, which I'll talk about in a second. And the last is virtual production, which emerges from cinema. Some images of the space. It's very large. It has a 40-channel motion capture system. It has a 41-channel ambisonics audio system. It's a very flexible space that things can be shifted around and darkened. There are multiple projection surfaces and so on. So it's a quite interesting lab space to experiment with these new technologies of immersion. Okay, now the predominant focus on the talk is on the question of extended reality. Now, extended reality is simply an umbrella term which arose about in the mid-2000s, which essentially unites two technological paradigms. One is virtual reality and the other is augmented reality. And the difference between these two is that virtual reality essentially creates a completely closed off, purely computer simulated world that you of course experience and access in a so-called head-mounted display, glasses that are closed off. A good example, of course, is the Oculus Quest or Oculus Rift or HTC Vive or what have you, or the Picos, for instance, in China. Augmented reality is different. Augmented reality is being able to see into the real physical world, but then to overlay information on top of that. So for instance, a lot of early uses of augmented reality are, of course, looking at scenes and seeing with sensors, seeing somehow something about the weather in that scene, or as you're driving a bike, seeing obstacles along the way that are computer generated into also glasses, but you see into the real world. Now we are moving, as many of you know, in these discussions of the so-called Metaverse, we are increasingly moving to a paradigm which has long been discussed in computer science, but has been not really up to now technically realized, which is called mixed reality, which essentially embeds, but let's say merges the physical world and the computational world together. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in that direction. I want to start with three images or three videos. And they come from three different eras, you might say, historical eras. The first is from the mid-9th century, although, of course, the video I'm going to show you is more recent. But the form comes from the mid-9th century. The second comes from the mid-1960s, and the last comes from 2021. I'm going to start with that. Okay, I'll just show you the next one, then I'll talk about these. The next is from 1968. And the last is from October 2021.
Imagine you put on your glasses or headset and you're instantly in your home space. It has parts of your physical home recreated virtually, it has things that are only possible virtually, and it has an incredibly inspiring view of whatever you find most beautiful.
Hey, are you coming?
Yeah, just gotta find something to wear. All right, perfect.
Boy.
Oh, hey, Mark. Hey, what's going on?
Hi.
Mark. What's up, Mark?
Whoa, we're floating in space? Who made this place? It's awesome.
Right? It's from a crater I met in LA.
This place is amazing.
All right, I think we don't need to see any more of that. So these are three eras. The first I showed you is wayang kulit, which is a Malay-originated, predominantly now Javanese puppet theater that uses screen and flat shadow puppets to recreate, of course, usually the stories of the Indian epic, the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, from the mid-19th century. The second image is from 1968, and it's work from the computer graphics pioneer Ivan Sutherland, and it's the first realized head-mounted display. So you can imagine that from 1968. That was a 2-ton thing that sat on your head. But as Sutherland, I'll talk about in a second, Sutherland, of course, is perhaps the father of augmented and virtual reality. And then the last, of course, is Mark Zuckerberg's announcement of Facebook's transformation to a new company called Meta at the height of the COVID pandemic crisis. Now, what do these things have in common? Well, in an obvious way, they all involve different understandings of what we might call extending reality. So realities that aim to merge, mix, hybridize the virtual and the real, and which for our understanding means essentially a computationally simulated versus tactile, felt real world. If we listen to the meta version, it seems like this mixture, which is now, of course, framed as the metaverse, will be a new utopia. This is a place where the Microsoft CEO, Satya Nadella, claimed, quote, will change human interaction as we know it, unquote. But this mixing of realities is, as you see from these different examples, not really new, nor in the sciences, nor in the arts. So this is a statement from Ivan Sutherland, as I said, the grandfather of augmented and virtual reality. This is a famous article he wrote in 1965 called The Ultimate Display, where he said, we live in a physical world whose properties we have come to know well. With a sense of familiarity, we sense an involvement with this physical world, which gives us the ability to predict its properties well. For example, we can predict where objects will land, what well-known shapes look from other angles, and how much force is required to establish objects against friction. We lack corresponding familiarity with these more invisible forces, non-uniform fields, particles, the effects of non-projective geometry, etc. A display, however, connected to a digital computer gives us a chance to gain familiarity with concepts that are not realizable in the physical world. That's what, of course, Zuckerberg says in the same sentence about the metaverse. You can have objects that don't exist in the physical world, that only exist in the so-called virtual world. It is a looking glass into a mathematical wonderland. Now, Sutherland wrote that in 1965. He was being funded by the Office of Naval Research, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency of the U.S. Army, and so on. So many ways, virtual reality emerges, like many technologies, from U.S. military contexts. But this idea that we can inhabit this kind of mathematical world that we can't necessarily know to our senses is also not a really very new idea. The philosopher John Rachman says that, quote, he talks about the notion of the virtual, and the virtual is actually a very old concept. It dates back to the Latin term virtus, which means force or potential. The virtual often comes coupled with the actual, meaning that through which the potential of force or force becomes at once visible and effective. So this is really a different way of thinking about the virtual. We tend to think about the virtual as something which is simulated, but actually from its original definition, its original etymology, the virtual involves the force of something against something. Now, this also has little to do with this person. This is the Silicon Valley guru and also, let's say, computer scientist, Jaron Lanier, who is claimed to have coined the term virtual reality, okay, in the 1990s. But in fact, the earliest mention of the term virtual reality comes not from technology, but actually comes from the theater. It's the work of this person. This is the French theater actor and theorist Antonin Artaud, who wrote in the 1930s in a famous manifesto called The Theater and Its Double, that the theater, similar to another scientific practice, which was called alchemy, which actually, it's interesting, alchemy, of course, tend to think was predominant in Europe, but actually alchemy goes back actually to China. There was secret alchemical texts coming out of Taoism in China. The famous text, The Secret of the Golden Flower, is essentially a Chinese alchemical text from the, I believe, the 9th century. So, but Artaud claimed that theater was like alchemy. Alchemy is the practice of turning metals, base metals, into gold. Now, this is a proto-chemistry. It's actually the earliest form of science. Newton practiced it, although his alchemical notebooks were never revealed while he lived. They were only actually revealed in the early part of the 20th century for fear of being chastised as not a real scientist. But Artaud claimed that the theater, like alchemy, is not a real thing, but a stand-in for something else. And he claimed basically the theater was what he called a réalité virtuelle, a virtual reality, a fictional doubling of the real world. And basically Artaud said it is that alchemy and the theater are, so to speak, virtual arts. This is again from 1938, virtual arts. They do not carry their end, their reality within themselves. And this is very important to understand. So in fact, that we think about virtual reality, it does not, like the theater, it doesn't carry its own reality in it. It actually is a doubling of reality. Artaud says all true alchemists know that an alchemical symbol is a mirage, as the theater is a mirage. So when you see the theater, you know it's not real, right? When you watch something on stage, it's completely rehearsed. It's fake. It doesn't exist it exists in the real world, but it's referring only to itself. This perpetual allusion to the materials and the principle of the theater found in alchemical books should be understood as the expression of identity existing between the world in which characters, objects, images, and all that constitutes the réalité virtuelle, the virtual reality of the theater, develops, and the purely fictitious and illusionary world in which the symbols of alchemy are evolved. So again, to understand this, you have to think about alchemy, the symbols of alchemy, the gold, the metals, the chemical processes, all stand in for something else, just as the theater stands in for something else. And that's why the theater is actually this kind of virtual reality, as Artaud claims. Now, this is also interesting to look at. This is from Japan. This is a 600-year-old theater tradition, which is called no theater. No theater is played out on a particular kind of stage with elaborate costumes and masks, and tell classic stories that emerged from farming rituals in the 14th century, and then of course, became a theater for the court. It was highly stylized. It involves dance, music, text, facial movement, and so on. And what I want to argue is that, in fact, also no is this kind of, let me just pause this, is this kind of virtual reality. It puts you in a trance as you watch it, particularly if you don't understand the language, which is, in fact, it's in Japanese, but it's in a very old form of Japanese that is no longer spoken today. So even before Artaud talks about the virtual, earlier performance forms coming out of Asia, coming out of China, out of Japan, out of India, were very much not focused on the stage as a realistic environment that reflected everyday life, but in fact a place where ghosts, spirits, and things that didn't exist in the world were actually staged. And this is very, very interesting. None of these forms also carry their reality in themselves. They are doublings of reality, as Artaud says. So for instance, no theater comes out of Shinto and Buddhist practice. It has featured these ghosts on stage. Its trance-like movement and tempo produce a very strange effect in the audience, where you go into certain mental states. You go in between being awake and being asleep, being half conscious and being alert, being in this in-between state. And this is very, very interesting. And as I showed you earlier, with this is in Indonesia, with the shadow puppet theater, this term wayang in Malay means ghost or shadow skin. And it also plays with a doubling of reality. So for instance, one sees these shadows on the screen, but of course, the way you see them is the screen is lit from behind with a torch. And as you move this, this torch, or it's usually a coconut wick flame, as you move this back and forth behind this screen called the kelia, the depth of the screen changes. It's very, very different than our understanding of 3D, where we look at our computer screen and it's flat. Here, you have a kind of infinite depth. And so as you move this torch and you have these shadow puppets, which are flat behind the screen, these tend to create different forms of they become 3D or they become flat. And so they change in depth. The shadows appear and disappear like ghosts or apparitions. Now, the reason I'm talking about these forms that have nothing to do with computers is that they might give us ways of understanding some of the core issues in extended reality. And now I'm going to jump now to the present. And these issues involve the following. There are 4 terms I'm going to talk about. One is presence, one is immersion, one is augmentation, and one is interaction. And I'm going to present basically some positions as opposed to answers. And what I also want to argue, and this might be evident from the examples I've shown you, which are not really technological, except of course from the head-mounted display of Sutherland and Zuckerberg, is that I want to place the human body and the human senses in their social, cultural, biological, and technical significance at the center of what I'm going to say now, okay? That the human body is really the core element of what we might understand as extended reality. And then that body is mediated, its form is changed, its appearance is changed, its presence is changed by a technological environment. Whether that technological environment involves computer-generated images, or in a very, very simple way, a flame, like in the wayang kulit, the puppet theater. And in fact, it's very interesting because VR, the technical interface of virtual reality or augmented reality, when you wear it on your body, is essentially your body, okay? Without your body, it doesn't function. This is very different than other media forms. Radio, television, video, film, all work. Of course, they're meant to be watched or heard, but they work without bodies in the audience. VR does not work without movement. And earlier virtual reality devices in the 1990s had a very simple sensor, a 3-axis, so-called 3-degree of freedom sensor that allowed you to turn your head and the scene would change. More recently, virtual reality involves what we call 6 degrees of freedom sensors. Those are sensors that allow us not only to move our head in X, Y, Z, but also to move forward and backwards, which allows the system to track us, our bodies in real space, to orient the device in real space, and accordingly to shape our experience based on that. All right, so let's talk about presence. Presence is extremely important because it's a debated term in virtual reality. It's a very long debated discussion, and it's been highly researched in virtual reality. Now, presence is importantly in virtual reality. So this is, again, images from 1968 from Ivan Sutherland's Ultimate Display, the first, let's say, computer augmented head-mounted display. But presence in virtual reality has always been thought about as, because you can't see the world around you, you're closed off, which is very different than this device where you can actually see into the environment. Presence has been thought about in terms of the illusion of presence. It's what Mel Slater calls the place illusion, that we have the experience of being in a place, even though the real place we're in is irrelevant to the virtual experience. And this is in spite of the fact that you know you're not there. So up until very recently, presence in virtual reality is always what Marvin Minsky originally called telepresence. It's the sense of presence at a distance. So when you wear an HMD, wear a virtual reality device, you see an avatar, you may see an avatar of somebody else or yourself, but that avatar is, of course, here. It's not in the physical space. And when you wear a virtual reality headset, of course, you forget that you have a body from your neck down. You think about your head and your eyes predominantly, and then your ears secondly. So your sense of your own bodily presence and the sense of others around you is non-existent. So presence has been very much defined in this virtual way. One of the more important researchers, Bioka and Delaney, say that the measure of presence in virtual reality is the degree to which the virtual environment submerges the perceptual system of the user and gets them away from the real world. Okay. Now, let me just show you, this is a dumb thing from YouTube. This is a technology that some of you might be familiar with. It's called video pass-through. I just run this. So this is a screen, but
instructions and audio and everything at my disposal in front of me while seeing everything as well. These instructions.
Okay. So what you see there in that video is you see a computer generated video, but then you also see the real environment. This is a feature that's been recently introduced in virtual reality headsets, and predominantly the Oculus Quest 2. It's also in the Pico 4 that's just come out. It's also in the Oculus Quest Pro. This is a technology called Passthrough. So Passthrough essentially takes the cameras on the side of the device, which essentially orient the device in space. They're essentially, the cameras are sensors, are very low resolution, and allows the user to suddenly see what the camera sees in the headset. So it delivers a live video image through these cameras in place of our eyes. So it'd be like you would look through the headset into the real world. Of course, the camera's on the side, not your eyes, so they're not stereoscopic. They give you a very strange, almost flat 2D version of the world you're in. But it approximates essentially what you would see if you were looking directly through the headset. And it transforms, more importantly, the virtual reality device into a new kind of experience, because you can now suddenly see the world, but you can also embed, computer-generated objects, images, sounds into that real world. Okay. Now, what's also really interesting is not only can you embed computer-generated things, you can also see the world. So you can see yourself. You can look down and see your hands and your face and your body and your legs, not your face, but your torso, your feet, and you can also see other people. And this is what is called in sociology the experience of co-presence. Co-presence means the experience of others in a physical space, which is a co-located space, not one where one is on Zoom like now and one communicates with someone in another place, but literally we're in the same physical space and sharing that physical space. So what happens now when we start wearing these devices and we look into the physical world, and yet that physical world is being mediated by things that are not physically there? And I'll show you an example at the end of the talk. So this is, again, Sutherland. You can see that in the 1960s, this idea was already thought about, that the idea of looking into this wonderland, this mathematical wonderland, is where you basically would have this experience of your body, not only your head, but your whole body moving and adjusting. You can see that that cube is looking into a video projected vision of the world that one is seeing, okay? So the next step is to go away from presence as virtual and think about presence as what two researchers called Saker and Frith call a kind of co-extension of space. And this is actually very, very interesting, because up until very recently, presence in virtual reality has been thought about as about this virtual notion of presence, not being there, but believing you're there. And now we move between what Saker and Frith say, the digitality of virtual reality and the concrete reality of our surroundings. All right, now let's talk about immersion. If we follow this thread of digitality of VR and the reality of our surroundings, we come to this second idea, which is called immersion. And let's say, I'm going to quickly run through this because I don't have a lot of time. There's a huge amount of historical thinking, but this is one example of people think about immersion. This is a cave. You're surrounded, virtual reality glasses. You're surrounded by 3D images. Oliver Grau in this book, Virtual Art, says that there's been a long trajectory in art historical context from the concept of illusion to the concept of immersion. He says, in each epoch, extraordinary efforts were made to produce maximum illusion with technical means at hand. So this is, for instance, the Battle of Sedan, a large-scale panorama from the 19th century. This is Sensurround, which was a film technology from the 1970s in the United States. This is, of course, IMAX, which you all know, which is a kind of wraparound screen that incidentally comes from Canada, which was premiered in 1967 at the World's Expo there, and stereoscopic displays. But so VR is always, and XR is always seen as kind of having the monopoly on this idea of immersion. These are immersive technologies, we always say. But you can see from these examples that wearing a head-mounted display is not particularly immersive. So I'll give you other examples. This is Brian Geisen and William S. Burroughs, the famous Dream Machine, which is a rotating object with a light bulb inside, which if you close your eyes produces a flickering effect. So you go in and out of consciousness. You start to see images because the neurons in your brain are firing because they don't see anything, but they get these light patterns. This is the cybernetician and neuroscientist Gray Walters' work with flicker, where using brain waves, you could control the flickering of light. So you could essentially adjust this kind of hallucination you might have. These are flotation tanks from the 1960s, where you are submerged or immersed in water. That's one of the places you really are immersed, where you're surrounded not by screens, but from your head down, you're in water, and as you move, the water moves around you. So immersion also involves this feedback between you and the environment, and so on. So in this book, Sensing Machines, I try to understand what this question of immersion means. This is Marshmallow Laser Feast. This is Team Lab. These are all kinds of immersion that are now imagined to be new. But if you go back to the 1930s in Europe, this is Marcel Duchamp's famous exposition for the Surrealist exhibition, where Duchamp wanted to turn off the lights and have sensors that would trigger lights when you got close to paintings. So you could see the painting from a distance with light, and then the closer you got, the painting would go into darkness. He also hung sacks with coffee, with dirt. The dirt fell on the audience. He roasted coffee in the space. He wanted this total experience of immersion. This is the Bauhaus. This is the work of Moholy-Nagy, who imagined a theater of machines and sounds and sense. This is one of the important Bauhaus female artists. This is, now we're in the Metaverse.
Sorry that there's some technical issue. We just wait for a while. Okay, we'll wait for Professor Sauter to get connected again. Okay, so please be patient, and then we'll get connected with the professor soon.
sorry, there was an internet collapse. Let me just go back here.
Okay.
Sorry
thank you.
about that.
No worries. No worries.
Let me just go back here. So as I was saying, these artists like Popova in Russia, they were dealing very much with this kind of transforming environment. And now, like I said, we're back to this metaverse. So the metaverse seems to be brand new, and it basically shows that we cannot separate technical life from our social lives. But the larger question is, what is this experience that's being planned for us? What happens when we are purely in a virtual world 24/7? And it's important to think about, is it just about the mall of the metaverse? Is it just about shopping? The researcher Ronald Zuma really says that the key challenge of this between being in these different worlds is how to enable virtual content that is integrated with the surrounding real world while users remain engaged with and aware of that real world. So this is very important to understand that, like, we're not just going to be inside this screen-based world all the time, as you can see from the way artists in contemporary ways and also in historical ways have dealt with these large questions. Okay, now I'm going to talk quickly about augmentation. As I said at the start, the key to understanding extended reality is to have a deep knowledge of the bodies that are key to the workings of its technical systems. And so there is this constant mutual entanglement between humans and machine sensing, which enables multifaceted possibilities of new forms of perceiving and acting, okay? Now, of course, we know we're constantly being tracked with data. XR headsets are, as Jeremy Bailenson at Stanford says, extremely rich data technologies that can essentially gather very specific information about users' bodies. So this idea, as I brought up earlier about the technology interface, is very important to understand that virtual reality it doesn't only work with the body, okay? And at the same time, it produces very strange experiences. It produces what Anna Munster says, both dematerialized senses of the self, but also intense sensorial experiences. So you have this tension between this dematerialization of our bodies and at the same time, this corporal experience. And as I said, once we start exploring this extended reality world, we go into a very different understanding of what our body means inside this mix between virtual and real environments. And at the same time, of course, these systems are highly normative and that's what we would call ableist. They're not meant for disabled bodies. In fact, I just read a thing on Medium this morning where a disabled programmer complained that still to this day, there is no text captioning in applications built for Meta headsets. That's one thing about text captioning. So for the blind, it's for the deaf, it's very difficult to use these things. If you're in a wheelchair, you have extreme problems because avatars are always about standing and not sitting. The whole hand controllers are difficult to hold if you have arthritis or motor problems. So these technologies are extremely normative and not thought about for multiple bodies. So that's very important to understand that even though we think about everyone's going to be in the metaverse, the question is who's going to be in this metaverse. And finally, I'm going to end up with interaction. And I want to talk in maybe, let's say, like 7 minutes, and then we have maybe a few minutes for questions since we broke, is a project that we just did that is a concrete example of perhaps all of these issues about immersion, presence, interaction. And it's a project called Animate. It's an extended reality work based on climate change, which we just staged in Germany, a very large performing arts festival, and now is touring. And it's at the crossroads of different performance forms: performance, theater, radio play, installation. And it uses these new extended reality, this video pass-through technology to explore the consequences of climate change. And it's not a project like many artistic projects about climate change, which involve kind of trying to communicate science and technology, facts about climate change to an audience. It's much more about trying to create a dramatic experience where you feel this climate transformation in your body. The story takes place in Canada, in Newfoundland, which is a northeast island off the coast of Canada in a very interesting area called the Tablelands, which you see on your right. Tablelands is a very famous tree.
Weather events dominated headlines around the world last year.
Last
Heat
ice
records in
age
DC killing more than 100 people.
very
Wildfires
deep
in
earth.
California.
So basically, it's a
Texas,
large
knocking out the state's
landscape.
power grid.
Walk on the Earth's mantle, one of the few places in the world. You can also trail that goes up there. So it's a very mysterious place in the midst of a very wild landscape. And the story that takes place is about two characters, Daniel and Lori, who are fleeing climate change. And as they flee climate change, they are on this distributed area. And what happens is there's an audience a very intimate audience of 12 people, and they essentially go through three environments. First, they experience a theater play with two actors who essentially do a reading about taking the short story. It was a short story which we then adapted into a dramatic script. And then the audience goes into a virtual space, into a virtual reality space. They're led in a group by the actors on a rope in a very large room. And they experience this movement toward these tablelands, this site in Canada in this virtual way. But they're also connected to others. They are walking in a space which is very large. They walk on surfaces which change. There are rocks and water and dirt. So it's a very sensorial experience. And then the final space, they encounter an idea that comes up throughout the script, which is rocks, stones. These stones appear again and again as an image, as a metaphor throughout the theater experience. And at the end, these stones literally come alive and create a storm. So it looks like a kind of incredible storm of stones that essentially absorb these two human beings. So in fact, the landscape, that's why it's called animate, the landscape itself becomes alive. The site we did it in is this very large industrial hall. This was the premiere, and it's been touring to smaller spaces. Perhaps we will show it in Hong Kong someday. But this is a very large industrial hall in Weimar, Germany. And this is the space, part of the space we used. Now, this kind of space is not usually used for these VR headsets, which are meant to be used in your living room. So it's quite a challenge to take these technologies, which were meant for consumer markets, and put them in a professional artistic context that is not simply one person at a time, but actually a group of people. Is a very large team of students, of artists, of performers, of composers, musicians, sound designers, voice directors, scenographers. We had a 49-channel audio system based from Berlin, a system called 4D Sound, a group called Monom in Berlin who worked with us. We used real-time physics and machine learning in the virtual reality. And I'm just going to show you essentially, here's some examples of modeling, biosignals. There were all sorts of research trajectories that went into this piece. Not all of them actually made it into the artistic work itself, but were kind of left aside because they were research things that didn't contribute to the aesthetic end result. But I'm just going to show you essentially a quick video, and then I'm done, of the project, and this will give you a sense. So what you see is three scenes. The first is more acted out as a piece of theater. The second is a mix between virtual reality and the physical environment, and the last is where the future might go, which is this augmented reality where these stones come alive and where people in this physical room see these virtual stones that rise and interact with the architecture of the space.
I want to see the tablelands.
Some people call it the soul of the earth.
For instance, this is the virtual reality doesn't look like normal virtual reality. It's very painterly-like and foggy. These are stones which the audience can gradually start to interact with, and you can start to see later they
Animate.
rise and they
So what's
explode
inanimate?
through the actual space. At the end, the audience. Really one of the first productions to use this pass-through technology. What is strange is that these virtual objects are at the scale of your body. So you really think they're there. So audiences run from these flying animated stones, feel actually this is what VR is called the plausibility. You believe what is, even though you know it's there. This is quite powerful because you see others reacting as well. So you really feel that you're in a collective experience, which is essentially the same experience we have right now. Climate change is a collective problem. We're not isolated. We are deeply immersed. We cannot escape this planet. So it very much deals with some of these questions that I've been I'm back. It deals with the in this real life way, using these very recent technologies, and for let's say framing them away from simply being isolated in a computer-generated world, and people back between let's say oscillating between the real world and this say extended world. So in that way, extended reality is a good example of such. This project is a good example of such extended reality. That's all I have. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Sauter. Thank you very much. Okay. So let's go to the panel discussion, because apart from the lecture theater, we also have the audience from the online. Okay, so any question from student, the audience, or from the online? During you thinking of the questions, it's very impressive for you that give the concept, especially about the force. The idea about virtual reality, okay, you use a force to explain it and link it with some of the historical perspective, from the puppet shadow to HMD, the head-mounted display, to the coming future of the matter. Okay, so they're all very impressive because of people not just think about virtual reality from just the side of the technology, but also in the past, actually, we are all think of the goal or the purpose, okay, to have the doubling or the kind of representation to grab something that maybe it's outside the world or something that have been passed away. It's all, we all are chasing the kind of reality, not just using the technology. Because the puppet shows and also the puppet show or even the painting, we are all thinking of something like the forces or something kind of exact sort of virtual realities. So here I have a question, because in the past, okay, we just deal with the visual and then we think of the audio. But now as an artist, okay, we go to the immersion, augmentation and interaction. We not just deal with visual audio, but also we have to think of the interaction design, the performance design. Okay, what do you think of the challenge for the future artists?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's a big issue because you know, the examples I showed you of puppet theater, and when you see these experiences, when you go to Java, real Blankulet, it's a complete sensory experience. You're outside, you're you're eating, you fall asleep, you wake up because they go on all night. You have a very different understanding of time versus putting in an HMD and having a 10-minute game experience. So the challenge is to think about all the senses. It's interesting too, because we tend to think about 5 senses. These come from Europe, Aristotle's idea of these 5 senses, but in fact, we have many other senses. One of the most important senses for virtual reality or extended reality is proprioception, the sense of your body in space, how you feel, where you feel your limbs are in space. And that involves kinesthetic, it involves vestibular, your sense of balance, your sense of where you are, your orientation. So this is a very important sense, which we never tend to think about. We tend to think about designing everything on a screen and then putting it on a screen. So the challenge is to think about designing for human bodies and the rich sensory experience of human bodies, and then extending that, transforming that. So creating things that you can't do in the real physical world, but never forgetting that we're always in that physical world, And the other thing is what's really key is people storytelling or dramaturgy. It's in the early histories of mediums. One plays with the medium because one tries to understand what the medium does. So it's very interesting in the early example of video art, and it started in the 1960s. People turned cameras on. Nam June Paik famously drove to New York, took images of the Pope who was visiting. Artists turned the cameras on screens, on monitors to create feedback. And then they gradually realized that that's exploring the medium to try to understand it. But then you have to go away from that. You have to start to deal with like what can the medium do? How does it address larger questions of human experience? War, famine, climate transformation, the way technologies shape our cognition. All of these questions that currently today we're grappling with as a species are ripe for exploration. So it's going beyond the technology. The technology is critical. It's not just a tool. It shapes our senses, it shapes our perception, it shapes our entire experience of our bodies. But it's to go beyond simply the tricks of the technology and to think about what stories, what experiences do I want to create as a designer or as an artist or as an interaction designer, and that experience is really critical because otherwise you're just going to simply show technology as a demo, which is what Meta does.
Okay, thank you, Professor Slaughter. Okay, so any question from the audience? Okay, so thanks a lot for your insightful seminar today. So, okay, we look forward to seeing you again, especially work you saw in Sweden, Germany, but I will also maybe in future it can be shown in Hong Kong as well, right? Okay,
that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you so much.
Seminar. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.